It's November 2021. COVID-19 is still with us. Who would have thought in February 2020, when we first heard about this virus, that we would still be struggling to control it all these months later? First and foremost, I want to acknowledge the devastating effect of the virus on families and individuals, those who have lost loved ones, and those who are living with the ongoing effects of long COVID. I'm constantly really saddened to hear what people are going through. In this video, I'm going to talk about the effects of the virus on the board game industry. Where has COVID-19 impacted most significantly, and what can we expect the legacy to be as we settle into a new normal of living with the virus? I'm Adam Porter. I'm a game inventor from the UK. I've been designing games for the last 8 years or so, and I have 7 published games to my name, plus a few more on the way. I recently posted a video about the board game industry and how the various different elements interrelate. I'm going to post a link at the end of this video if you want to go back and watch that one to discover a bit more about what we're talking about today. So let's use the same pictographic that we used in that video to give us an overview of the industry. So you can see that the various creatives, including game inventors, feeding into publishers who go on to work with manufacturers, distributors and crowdfunding platforms to get their products out there. Awareness is raised through board game media, through conventions and in board game cafes, and games are sold in physical stores and online. At the end of the chain, of course, are millions of game players, the very core of the board game industry. COVID-19 has affected every single link in that chain. So let's start at the top of our board game industry meeple and talk about the players. The effect of COVID on the gaming community has been pretty obvious. Players around the world are unable to attend gaming meetups. They can't invite friends round for a games night. They can't always get out to the shops. Travelling is heavily restricted and many conventions have been cancelled. Board games are a social experience and the coronavirus is an antisocial little bugger. Of course, the virus has also impacted on people's jobs, reducing their available budget for games, forcing people to prioritise their spending elsewhere and impacting heavily on their mental health, potentially reducing their enthusiasm for hobbies and interests. It's a really sad picture. But gamers are problem solvers, they're tacticians, they're creatives, and many of them have made the most of the situation. They've been dabbling in solo games for the first time, or building up their collection of 2-player games to play with their partner, or adapting party games to play with friends over Zoom, or switching to platforms like Board Game Arena, Tabletop Simulator or Tabletopia to get their fix. These digital platforms have benefited massively from a sudden influx of new players, and there's no doubt that this is an area of industry growth. In February of 2021, Asmodee purchased Board Game Arena, signalling its pivotal role in the industry. Asmodee is a $2 billion behemoth, and they love to pick up influential and profitable companies to add to their portfolio. Digital board games have been around for a long time, but they've never occupied as central a place in the industry as they do right now. The primary industry contact for players is with retailers, both physical and online, and there's no doubt that they have suffered. Board game retail was a tricky business even before the pandemic. Thousands of new releases each year, along with pretty short shelf lives before the game's forgotten, left retailers feeling baffled about which games they should stock and how they were supposed to keep up with the constant deluge of new releases, most of which resembled each other extremely closely. And how are they supposed to compete with online stores who have lower overheads and can afford to offer discounted prices? Physical hobby stores live or die based on the in-store experience that they offer. If gamers enjoy visiting, then they're happy to pay a few pounds more for their gaming fix, but months of on-off lockdowns, reduced footfall and disrupted supply chains have hit retailers hard. Stock isn't shifting, so how can they accommodate those hot new releases? Mass market stores have a degree of protection here. International chains are massive entities, which allows them some scope to maneuver a tricky new environment. But the core principles are the same. If stock isn't shifting and consumers aren't buying, then the company is going to end up in trouble. Fortunately for mass market stores, sales of classic games, so your Monopoly, your Risk, your Uno, they've been doing very well indeed. Families with fewer opportunities to leave the house for leisure purposes do their best to bring their entertainment indoors. They purchase the stuff that they know, the only games they've heard of. They don't know any better. Their eye might be drawn to a new board game based on a familiar TV or film series, but they're unlikely to be sampling the latest niche titles from the hobby side of the market. Online stores have had an advantage over the last 18 months. Unaffected by lockdowns, they're able to get their product to customers without the need to pay huge rental for a central city location. Many physical retailers have focused much more on their online presence during the pandemic to keep their shops afloat. But sadly, many retailers will not have been able to weather the storm, and company closures are inevitable. Board game cafes occupy their own little niche corner of the board game world. Their model is of course related to retail, but it's much more focused on hospitality, the provision of coffee and cakes, and a lovely environment in which to socialise. As with all hospitality businesses, they've been hit hard. And their unique selling point of offering a fun game to play while you're sipping on your vanilla latte has proven a little bit problematic in the middle of a pandemic. Handling playing pieces, passing cards back and forth between players, and the same game being played multiple times a day by many different groups is a transmission risk. Now, as it's become more apparent that this virus is airborne, perhaps those risks have become less prominent in the minds of the visitors, but many gamers just aren't ready to get out there just yet. As with hobby stores, board game cafes have seen closures too. And those who are persevering, tenacious in the face of adversity, are having to constantly adapt to changing regulation and guidance to keep their patrons safe. Conventions and trade fairs have faced similar issues. So Essenspiel, Gen Con, UK Games Expo are massive events which many publishers rely on to get their new products seen and to build hype. But don't forget the major toy fairs in New York, Nuremberg and London. These have all been equally disrupted. Cancellations of massive events like these has a major impact on publishers. Many games released in 2020 and 2021 never had their moment to shine. Great games were lost in the shuffle, unnoticed by the masses, just because they never had a chance. The shift to online conventions in 2020 felt a little bit clunky and awkward. It just wasn't a natural fit, and I don't see this being a major solution, not a major player in the future. It's pleasing to see the return of the giant conventions in 2021 though, even if they're looking a little bit battered with reduced attendance by publishers and consumers alike. I think physical conventions and trade fairs are going to continue to happen over coming years. Without them, the industry just loses its heart and its soul. The organisers will need to be creative and adaptable to deal with whatever COVID throws at them next. Of course, board game media, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok and Twitch can carry some of the weight, and the pandemic has seen many of these channels grow enormously. And that brings us to the game publishers. What are they to do? How can they keep their businesses afloat in such a volatile environment? Publishers frequently work with distributors who gather together stock from many different companies worldwide, and the distributors only buy product from the publishers if they think they can shift it. And that's very dependent on the situation with the retailers. They're sitting on a lot of old stock and they need to keep things moving. In 2019, publishers were starting to realise that the board game market was saturated. There were just too many new releases, which made it hard to spot good or even great games amongst the mess of other titles. And even if they were noticed, their success was short-lived because a new darling would come along soon to take their place. Publishers had long relied on the scattergun approach to game releases, produce a large number of games each year in small print runs, send them out into the world, see what generates buzz, and double down on those titles with repeated print runs and enhanced marketing, leaving a whole lot of white noise in the system. Little forgettable titles clogging up the game store shelves, distracting from the cream of the crop. Publishers started to reduce their output to focus on only a handful of titles each year, the best of the best, and really support those titles. They strategized. What innovations did the industry need? Where were the gaps in the market? What were players asking for? And they honed in on those titles. In 2021, publishers are realizing that familiarity is a driver of sales. The most popular evergreen titles are selling very well indeed. Ticket to Ride, Catan, Codenames, Azul, Pandemic. Publishers are starting to identify their best-selling products and build on that success with sequels, reworkings, and new additions. If they want to attract attention to a new game, it better have some sort of familiar hook. Perhaps an intellectual property from TV and film. With familiarity driving sales, the publishing world is turning its attention to branding. Now, a major stumbling block in this whole picture is the manufacture of games. This is a complex issue and it's one that I don't fully understand myself. But the basic cost of materials has increased enormously. The cost of cardboard is one really important example, and this is down to many disruptions in the supply chain, a reduced workforce, sick employees, restriction on travel, reduced incomes, altered demand, and many other factors. So manufacturing costs have increased. It simply costs more to make a board game. But the biggest issue in 2021 is shipping. Most board games are made in China. That's just where the industry lives. Sure, there are other manufacturers around the world, but they don't have the same scale, the expertise, the resources, and they aren't able to match the low prices and high quality which Chinese manufacturers achieve. The shipping industry was already struggling before the pandemic. The infrastructure wasn't great, it wasn't all that profitable an industry, so there was little improvement being made, and space on ships was already at a premium. The cost of a 20-foot container had increased from $3,000 to $5,000 in a relatively short period. And during the early months of the pandemic, the factories started closing down. But during that same period, demand for physical goods rose. Unable to leave their houses, shoppers moved online and purchased physical items with the money that they would have spent on holidays and evenings out. They upgraded their furniture, their gardens, their wardrobes. Put simply, people were just buying more, and this created a backlog. There was massive demand, but nothing was moving. Add in staff shortages, lockdowns, and government interventions, and the problem became huge. Shipping times became totally unpredictable, and the shipping companies could charge astronomical prices, such was the demand. The price of a container doubled, then trebled, in some cases quadrupled. It became very expensive and very unpredictable to ship games. Containers sat at ports for weeks or months. Some got lost, buried among other containers. Some sat offshore on a boat for months. The shipping situation has become chaotic. The demand continues to increase and the infrastructure is just too massive to evolve at a fast enough pace to keep up. Frankly, it seems that things are likely to get worse before they get better. So what does this mean for the economics of making a game? Well, in my previous video, I discussed the distribution of money among the various agencies involved in producing a board game using the universal board game currency of wheat. My massively simplified pictogram suggests that if a board game had a manufacturing cost of 10 wheat, it would be sold by the publisher for 20, by the distributor for 30, and by the retailer for 60 wheat. This is what the customer pays. The inventor of the game receives 1 wheat per copy sold. Well, let's suppose the cost of raw materials has increased. It's now 7 wheat. Once shipping is factored in, the publisher is now paying 20 wheat per unit, double their normal costs. That cost is passed on to the distributor and then the retailer, and the retailer's overheads have really increased, so they can't take the hit. So a game which previously sold for 60 wheat now costs 100. The big question is, will consumers pay it? There are several ways that publishers can address this situation. The easiest and the most immediately actionable approach is to reduce box sizes. If you can fit more games into a container, you significantly reduce your shipping costs. But this doesn't address the delays and the unpredictability of shipping across the globe. There's still no guarantee that your game will turn up in time for a convention or a trade fair. Publishers could turn to more local manufacturers, but this is likely to result in paying more money for an inferior product and hitting stumbling blocks along the way as those smaller manufacturers struggle to deliver on the complex productions and high standards expected by gamers and publishers in 2021. Another route is to turn to crowdfunding. So crowdfunding sites allow publishers to sell directly to their customers, potentially cutting out the distributor and the retailer and hence keeping more profit for themselves. The money is paid by customers up front before the game's in stock, potentially even before it's manufactured. In many ways, it resembles a pre-order system. This gives the publisher certainty about the demand. Many gamers follow Kickstarter as a source of information about new games. It has a built-in marketing platform without the need for conventions or trade fairs. Delays are commonplace with crowdfunding campaigns, so customers are generally quite forgiving about issues with shipping and manufacture, and it allows a publisher to test the waters with higher prices and see what the consumer reaction is without the risk of trying to sell an overpriced product at retail. We've recently seen Queen Games attempting to sell a collection of 4 Euro games for over $700. Kickstarter games are frequently big, massive even, loaded with components and expansions. There is scope to make a large profit from a single purchase. I can see many companies moving into this space, perhaps reserving their smaller, more familiar titles for retail and their big box releases, Deluxified to the max, going to Kickstarter or other crowdfunding platforms. And this brings us to the creatives. The inventors, the artists, the developers, app designers, miniature sculptors, graphic designers. What impact does it have on us? Well, I'll start with my own personal experience. I have 3 games which are signed for release. Were it not for the pandemic, all of them would probably have been released in 2020. But I have no idea when or if they will eventually come out. I'm not a full-time inventor. I don't rely on the income. And currently, I'm investing very little time in pitching to publishers. I see no big benefit in releasing my games to the world during such a volatile period. My best concepts will remain attractive in a couple of years' time when hopefully things might have settled a little. So I'm resting a bit. I know many inventors have gone the other way. More time at home means more time to design. An increased output means they want to get pitching, and thankfully, publishers have been adaptable and are often willing to take pitches online, to play games via Tabletop Simulator or other similar platforms. Personally, I enjoy the face-to-face interaction and relationship building too much to rely heavily on these approaches. I also know inventors and other creatives who are working full-time in the board game industry. They need to maintain a steady flow of releases or to maintain an enduring interest in their existing titles if they're going to be able to pay their bills. This is challenging in a pandemic, but familiar titles are selling well, and full-time designers are likely to have such a game under their belts. That's why they're full-time. Maintaining a constant dialogue with publishers that you've had a relationship with in the past is vital. What are their plans? How are they positioning themselves in the market? How can you assist them with that plan through your own designs? So here's a brief summary of what we've talked about. My predictions for a brave new world of tabletop games. 1. Smaller boxes. 2. More big box deluxe Kickstarter editions. 3. Expanded ranges of connected titles. 4. Sequels and remakes of familiar games. 5. More use of intellectual properties related to TV and film. 6. Development of new online gaming platforms. And 7. Large increases in retail cost. Of course, all of this is going to be totally out of date within a few months as the next world event shakes the industry. So I could be way off. Let's check back in a year or so and see how we're all doing. In the meantime, there'll be plenty more videos about board game design, the industry, and board game reviews on my channel. If you want to learn more about the industry, go back to my previous video on the topic. It's a great place to start. I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts about how the pandemic has changed the board game industry and your predictions for the future. Let me know in the comments. I hope you're all keeping well, look after yourselves and the people around you, and I'll see you next time. All the best.